My husband bought a house with the money he stole from our son and moved his girlfriend into it, so I turned his little scheme into the most expensive mistake of his life. Our son Albie is 23. He is the hardest working person I have ever known in my life. He started working when he was 15, bussing tables at a restaurant near our house. By 16, he was washing dishes. By 17, they had him on prep. He saved every paycheck from the first one. He didn't buy expensive shoes. He didn't go on trips with his friends. He didn't take girls to the movies the way other boys his age did. He told me when he was 17 that his goal was to buy a house before he turned 25, and from that day on, every dollar he earned was pointed at that goal. After high school, he got a job at a heating and cooling company. He started as a helper, and within 2 years, he had his certification and was running service calls on his own. He was making good money and still saving almost all of it. He moved into a small apartment with a coworker to keep his rent low. He drove the same car he bought at 18, a beat-up sedan with a cracked dashboard that he kept running himself in the parking lot of his apartment building on Sundays. He packed his lunch every day, the same way I'd packed his lunch when he was 8 years old. He brought home leftover bread from the restaurant on Sundays because the manager let him. He turned down a trip to the beach with his cousins 3 summers in a row because the gas alone would have been $100 he could put away instead. He picked up double shifts on holidays for the time and a half. He put his money into a savings account that he refused to touch. By the time he was 22, he had a little over $61,000 in that account, and he told us about it one night at dinner, like he was almost embarrassed by the number, like he didn't want to be the kind of person who counted out loud. Vince was sitting across from him when he said it. He looked at our son for a long moment and didn't say a word. But the next week he started calling Albie more than usual, inviting him over for dinner during the week, asking about his shifts, bringing up real estate, gently at first, and then not so gently. He told Albie that buying a house alone was risky for someone his age. He said the market was tricky. He said a young buyer without experience would get taken advantage of by every agent and inspector and seller he came across. He said the best thing Albie could do was partner with someone who'd been through it before. He meant himself. By January, Vince had Albie convinced. He told him that if they combined what they had, they could get a better property in a better neighborhood. He said Albie would put in his savings, and Vince would handle the mortgage and the paperwork, because his credit was stronger. He said they'd split ownership down the middle, and when Albie was ready to be on his own, he could buy Vince's half or they'd sell and split the profit. Albie believed him. Of course he believed him. He had been believing his father since he could speak. They found a house in March, a 3-bedroom about 20 minutes from us, on a quiet street with a yard. Albie wired his $61,000 to Vince for the down payment. Vince told him not to take the day off work for closing because the process was complicated and there was no point in him losing a day's pay. Albie agreed. He trusted his father completely. The house closed in April. Albie started spending every weekend out there. He painted every room himself, in colors he and some future girlfriend, whoever she'd turn out to be, might one day pick together. He replaced the baseboards along the back of the house. He fixed the fence in the backyard. He spent 3 weekends pulling up old carpet and laying down new flooring with his own 2 hands. He stained the back deck. He cleaned out the garage. He bought a riding mower with money he hadn't yet saved back from his account. In June, I noticed Vince was acting strange, on his phone constantly, leaving the house at odd hours. He told me he was going to check on the property. I didn't think twice about it because it was supposedly his and Albie's project. Then in July, on a Saturday morning, Albie drove out to finish the backyard fence and called me at 11. His voice was flat in a way I had never heard before. He said a woman had answered the front door when he walked up. She was in a robe. She told him she lived there. He had stood on the porch and asked her what she was talking about, and she had told him her name was Christy, and that Vince had given her a key 3 weeks ago, and that she'd been staying at the house since the beginning of the month. She had said it like Albie was the one who needed catching up. She had asked him, with her hand on the doorframe, who he was, and when he said he was Vince's son, she had laughed a small laugh and said Vince hadn't mentioned a son who came around. She said Vince had told her the house was his project, that he was fixing it up himself on weekends. She said it standing in the doorway of a room our son had painted at 6 in the morning the Saturday before. Albie said she'd looked at him standing on that porch like he was the one who didn't belong, like he was the intruder on his own property. Albie called his father from the front step of his own house. Vince told him to calm down. Christy was just a friend who needed a place to stay for a little while. Albie asked him why a friend was answering the door in a robe at 10 in the morning. Vince went quiet. Then he told Albie the truth, or the part of it he'd been hiding. The house was in his name only, just his. He said Albie was too young to be on a deed. He said the bank wouldn't approve a co-ownership with someone who had no credit history. He said he'd handled it the way it had to be handled. Albie asked when he was going to fix it. Vince said there was nothing to fix. Albie asked about his $61,000. Vince said it was a contribution, not a purchase. He said Albie had given him the money willingly, and there was no contract that said anything different, so legally, it was a gift. Albie hung up. He sat in his car in the driveway of the house he had painted with his own hands for 45 minutes before he could start the engine. He told me later he didn't cry. He just sat there and watched a curtain move in an upstairs window and tried to understand what had happened. Then he drove to our house. He walked through the front door and sat on the couch and didn't say a word for a long time. He stared at the coffee table. Then he looked up at me and said, "Dad took everything I had." I went upstairs and found Vince in our bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his shoes still on, looking at his phone. He didn't put it down when I came in. I closed the door behind me. I asked him to explain. He said Albie was young and would make the money back. He said $61,000 wasn't that much in the grand scheme of things. He said our son should be grateful for the lesson, because now he'd know to always get things in writing. That was how he framed robbing his child, a lesson. I asked him about Christy. He said he'd met her in February and things had moved fast. He said it like fast was a thing that had happened to him, not a thing he'd done. I asked him if the whole house plan had been about getting Albie's money to set up a place for his girlfriend. He didn't deny it. He just looked at the floor and said it wasn't that simple. I asked him to look at me. He didn't. Something in me went cold and still in that moment. Not sad, not confused, decided. I left the bedroom, walked back down the stairs, and sat next to Albie on the couch. I held his hand and I told him we were going to get every dollar back, and then some. Vince thought because he'd put his name on a piece of paper, he'd won. He had forgotten one thing. We were still married. Every move he'd made, the transfers, the deed, the mortgage application, had moved through accounts we shared, signed during a marriage that was very much still in force. That night, I sat in the dark of our bedroom and listened to Vince snore beside me like nothing in the world was wrong. He had eaten the dinner I'd made. He had watched his show. He had brushed his teeth. He had said goodnight. He had no idea I was already 3 moves ahead of him. The next morning, I called Joanne. She's been my closest friend for over 20 years, and she works at a law office. I sat on the back steps with the phone pressed to my ear, and I told her everything from the beginning. How Albie saved his money. How Vince convinced him to buy a house together. How the deed ended up in Vince's name only. How Christy was living in the house my son paid for. How Vince called $61,000 a gift like it was nothing. Joanne listened the whole way through and didn't interrupt once. When I was done, she said, "Start gathering documents. Every statement, every transfer, every closing record you can find. Don't tip him off. Photograph everything and put it back." That night, while Vince watched a game in the living room with a beer in his hand like nothing was wrong, I went into the office and started on the filing cabinet, drawer by drawer. I pulled bank statements going back over a year. I found the transfer record from Albie's savings, the date and the amount printed clean across the page in tidy bank font. I found the closing documents for the house that Vince had shoved into the back of a folder like they were nothing. I found credit card statements I'd never bothered to look at. I found tax forms. I took pictures of every page with my phone, every single one, and I sent them to Joanne in a string of messages so long it took the app a minute to send. Then I put it all back exactly the way I had found it. When Vince came in around 11 and asked what I was doing, I said sorting old receipts. He didn't look twice. He just kissed me on the head and said don't stay up too late. I almost laughed when he closed the door behind him. 2 days later, Albie called me on a Wednesday night. His voice was tight, the way it sounds when he's trying to stay calm but barely holding it. He said Vince had shown up at his apartment that afternoon, just walked in like he still had a place there. He had a typed up document with him, a whole page of legal sounding language, the kind anyone with internet access could put together in 20 minutes. It said the $61,000 was a gift, that Albie had no claim to the property or any of the funds, and that he wouldn't pursue any future claim. In exchange, Vince would pay him $5,000 as a goodwill gesture. $5,000 out of $61,000. Albie said Vince had set the paper on the coffee table and pushed a pen across to him like the conversation was already over. I asked Albie if he'd signed it. He said no. He said he had looked at his father across the table, at the pen, at the page, and something in his chest had gone very still. He said he'd told Vince he needed to think about it, and Vince had gotten angry and left without taking the document with him. I said, "Albie, listen to me. Do not sign anything from your father. Not now, not next week, not ever. Photograph that paper and send it to me." He sent it within the hour. I sent it straight to Joanne. The next morning, I went back to the filing cabinet for the joint savings account statements. Something had been nagging at me since the night before. I compared the balance from 2 months ago against the current one. There was a difference of $8,000. I traced the transactions. Vince had moved $8,000 out of our joint savings and into an account I had never seen before. Not one of ours. Not one I had access to. He had opened it somewhere new, quietly, sometime in May, and drained money out of our shared savings into it. I sent that to Joanne too. She wrote back inside of 5 minutes. "Document everything. He's digging his own grave." I sat with that for a while. Vince probably thought he had every angle covered. The house in his name. The gift letter he'd tried to get Albie to sign. The secret account. He thought he was 3 steps ahead of everyone, but he wasn't ahead of anyone. He was burying himself with every move. Then I started thinking bigger than just the bank statements. The house was in Vince's name on the deed, but the mortgage was a different document, and I asked Joanne to pull the closing paperwork for me through her firm. She had a paralegal send over the public records that afternoon. I opened the file at the table with a cup of coffee going cold next to me, and I read the first page twice before what I was looking at registered. The loan was co-signed by Vince's older brother, Frank. Frank had put his name on the mortgage so Vince could get a better rate. Frank didn't know about Christy. Frank didn't know where the down payment had come from. Frank thought he was helping his brother and his nephew buy a house together. That's the version of the story Vince had told him over Thanksgiving last year. Sitting at our own dining room table, in front of all of us, I sat with that piece of paper for a long time. I read Frank's signature line 3 times. That was my opening. I called Vince's cousin first, the one I'd always been closest to on his side of the family. She picked up on the second ring. I told her plainly, with no softening, exactly what Vince had done. I told her about Albie's $61,000. I told her about the deed in Vince's name only. I told her about Christy living in the house. I told her about the gift letter, the secret account, all of it. She didn't say much while I talked. I could hear her breathing on the other end, and once, near the middle, the sound of her setting down a coffee cup hard on a counter. When I was done, she said one thing. "That son of a bitch." Quiet, like she was talking more to herself than to me. Then she asked me if Albie was alright. I told her he was holding. She said good. She said she had 3 boys of her own, and if any of their fathers had pulled this on them, she'd have done worse than what I was about to ask her to do. I sent her the photographs, the transfer record, the bank statement showing the hidden $8,000, the gift letter Vince had typed up for our son, the timeline laid out in order. I asked her to do one thing, get the documents to Frank. 2 days later, Frank called me. His voice was even, the way men get when they're trying not to start yelling and aren't quite managing it. Frank is the older of the 2 by 6 years. He'd put Vince through his last year of trade school. He'd loaned him the money for his first work van. He had been carrying his younger brother for 30 years. He asked if everything in those papers was true. I said yes. He asked if I had more. I told him I had everything. He asked me how long Vince had been lying to him about the house, and I told him since the beginning. The Thanksgiving story had been a lie. The brother and nephew investment had been a lie. The whole thing, from the day Vince signed the loan papers, had been a lie told to his face across our own dining room table. Frank didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear a clock somewhere on his end of the line. Then he asked me what I wanted. I told him exactly what I wanted, and I didn't soften any of it. Vince was going to sign the deed over to Albie. Vince was going to put the $8,000 back into our joint account, and Vince was going to refinance the mortgage in his own name, getting Frank off the loan entirely. If he didn't, Frank could call the bank himself and tell them what he'd just learned, that the down payment had come from a third party who was now disputing the title and had a typed offer from the borrower trying to extinguish that party's claim. That alone would trigger a fraud review on the loan, and the bank would not be kind about it. Frank was quiet on the other end for a long time. Then he said, "I'll handle it." He drove out to the house that Saturday morning. I was in our living room with a cup of coffee on the side table when my phone started ringing. First Vince, then a number I didn't recognize, then Vince again, then Christy, then Vince a third time. I didn't answer any of it. I just sat there and let it ring and watched the screen light up and go dark and light up again. Vince left 3 voicemails. I deleted them without listening. Joanne called once around noon to ask how I was doing. I told her my hands had stopped shaking about an hour earlier, and I was just waiting now. She said good. Around 3 in the afternoon, Albie called me. He sounded like he was holding his breath through the whole sentence. He said, "Mom, Uncle Frank just left here. He brought me a folder." I asked him what was in it. He read it to me, item by item. The signed deed, transferred into his name, free and clear. A cashier's check from Vince's account for $8,000, made out to me. And a handwritten letter from Vince, 3 pages long, that Frank had stood over him at the dining table of the house and made him write. It admitted, in Vince's own handwriting and signed at the bottom, that the $61,000 from Albie had been used as the entire down payment on the house. That Vince had taken that money without his son's knowledge or consent of how it would actually be used. That the title had been put in Vince's name alone with the intent to deceive. Frank told me later what had happened inside the house. He had walked in without knocking. Christy was in the front room watching television. Frank had set the folder of photographs down on the coffee table and asked her if she'd seen any of it before. She'd flipped through it, standing up, her face going through 3 different colors. Frank had given Vince 2 choices. Sign every page Frank put in front of him at the dining table, or every relative on both sides of the family would know what he'd done by Monday morning, and the bank would get a call before close of business that same day. Vince had tried to talk. Frank had told him to write, not talk. He had pushed a yellow legal pad and a pen across the table. He had dictated the first paragraph. Vince's hand had shaken so badly his first attempt was unreadable, and he'd had to start over. Frank watched him write all 3 pages. He told me Vince didn't look up once. He told me Vince made one sound during the whole thing, a small noise in his throat halfway through the second page, and Frank had told him to keep writing. Christy was already gone before Vince finished. She had read the photographs at the coffee table, looked at Vince in the dining room through the doorway, gone upstairs, packed a bag in 8 minutes, and walked out the front door past Frank without a word. She blocked Vince's number that night. Frank told me later she had asked him one question on the front walk before she got in her car. How much had he taken from his son? When Frank told her the number, she nodded once, slow, and got into the driver's seat without another word. Albie got the house, free and clear, in his name, his only. The $8,000 came back into our joint account that Monday morning. Vince walked out of that property the same Saturday afternoon with 2 duffel bags and his car, and he went somewhere I don't know about and don't ask about. I filed for divorce the following week. There was no fight left in him by then. He signed everything his lawyer slid across the table at the office where we did the mediation. The handwritten admission Frank had made him write was sitting in a safe deposit box at my bank, and he knew it, and I knew it, and his lawyer knew it after one phone call. The terms were clean. Albie moved into the house the next month. He kept the flooring he'd put down with his own hands. He kept the paint colors he'd picked. He replaced the locks on the first day he had the keys, every door, front and back and side. He sent me a picture that night. A new key sitting on the counter, next to the cashier's check stub from the $8,000, next to a beer he'd opened to celebrate. The caption underneath said, "In my name." I printed it. It's on the fridge. It's been there for almost a year now. Vince texts sometimes, long ones, the kind that start with, "I've been thinking," and end with blame. I don't read past the first line. He doesn't get to narrate this. He had 24 years to be the man he pretended to be at our dinner table, and he chose, in February of last year, not to be. He chose Christy. He chose the gift letter. He chose the secret account. He chose to look at his son across the coffee table in our living room and call $61,000 a teaching moment. The story ends where he stops being in it. Albie came over for dinner last Sunday. He brought a bottle of wine he'd bought himself, and a list of repairs he was planning for the back porch over the summer. He said he was thinking about getting a dog, something medium-sized, good around the yard. He said the place felt like his now in a way it hadn't right after he moved in, when every room still had the memory of someone else in it. He said the work he'd put into it meant something again. I told him it always had. He just had to get it back from someone who never deserved to hold it. He hugged me at the door before he left. Bigger than me now, rough hands from the job, the same kid underneath. He drove off and I stood on the porch in the cool evening and watched his taillights disappear at the end of the street. The house was quiet behind me, my own house, just mine now. I did not look back.